And welcome to the show. An economist from Sense Partners, it's Shamubeel Eaqub. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have a chat with you, Shamubeel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've featured on our show many times, sir, for your various public commentaries. So it's nice to finally meet face to face and say, hello, kia ora, and thanks for coming and having a chat with us.
Pleasure.
Of course, it is a big day. It is a budget day. I guess the first thing I'd like to do is just kind of throw you the ball and say, what are your thoughts on the budget? Although when we're recording this, we've only had the information for a couple of hours, but I'm sure you've been over a good portion of it. What are your initial thoughts on the budget that was delivered today?
Yeah, look, a little bit of context first. So the budget is really about that additional spending that we're going to make in the next few years, right? So if you think about how much money we're going to spend next year as a government, the budget is about 5% of it, and the other 95% is pretty much business as usual.
Right.
So it is very much at the increment. There was some really good stuff in the budget, and the really good stuff was really around not the how much money did I get, but it was that $77 billion they've committed to capital investment. So, as you know, New Zealand has a huge infrastructure deficit. It's in the order of over $200 billion. We really need to keep maintaining our assets, bring them up to spec, and we've been neglecting them for a long time. So that was very welcome. The rest of it was pretty ho-hum. There was stuff that some people were like, there was things like extending the early childhood education stuff, the removal of the $5 copay on prescriptions, which by the way is a great thing because it's ridiculous to fund most of the prescriptions, but stopping poor people from getting the medicine for $5.
Yeah.
There was good stuff around public transport, making it free for under 13s and half price for under 25. So there was good things, but they were at the margin. These were not like huge things, and we wouldn't have expected them because this is a election year. This is the setup, and we expect to see most of that contest of ideas and I guess the bribes to buy the votes really coming up in the coming months.
I like it how you use the word setup because I think about stand-up comedy, telling a joke. There's a setup and there's a payoff. So if this is the setup, then the payoff is the policies that'll come out during the election cycle to say what we'll do if you re-elect us. That's what you're saying, yeah?
Absolutely. And for the incumbents, it's actually a very tricky game, right? Because you want to make sure there's enough room for you to do the things that you want to do, but make sure you lock up as much of the money as possible so then the opposition can't do anything without changing things you've already promised.
Yeah, that's interesting. We talked about this last night, or in the last couple of nights, actually. We were saying, if I'm not saying that Labor's going to lose and National's going to win or anything, but if you were going to go out, I'd rather go out in a screaming ball of fire and, meaning not scorched earth, but meaning something that I'd go to war for, something that's inspirational. And if they put things in place before they go, then National kind of has to follow them on if they've been committed in the budget for the following years, even if they lose. That's fair, eh? That's how it kind of works.
It's kind of how it works. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was scorched earth in any way because, the kinds of things that was announced in this budget, they were pretty, they're kind of sensible, right? I mean, things like, prescription co-pays, you kind of look at that and you kind of go, would you really begrudge that to anybody? Not really. I think where this government has kind of locked up the budget is much more on that capital investment. So that's going to increase from an average of about $10 billion a year to about $18 billion a year for the next 3 years. So it's a huge increase in building our bridges and our hospitals and schools and those kinds of things. It's really hard for any political party to say, we're not going to build and invest in our country.
Yeah. And it's an investment over the next few years that will then benefit the country for the next 100 years as well. So it's an investment up front for a long-term return.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, we have so underinvested in our country, right? In our infrastructure. We're running down our roads, our bridges, our dams, our flood protections. These are things that have been cumulative over a number of decades. And we really need to get on top of it again. And I don't care which political party you come from. This has to be done because this is for future generations. It's not about us.
The government is calling it the bread and butter budget. The opposition seem to be calling it the big blowout. Is the truth more with one or the other of those, or do you find it somewhere in the middle?
Well, there wasn't a huge blowout in the sense that, yes, the borrowing is going to increase and the spending is increasing a bit, but it's nothing that would make you super concerned.
Right.
But I think from an opposition perspective, the real problem is there is no headroom to kind of do a lot of stuff without making big changes to essentially that investment program. And I think that'll be very frustrating to them.
Yeah.
Was it a bread and butter? Not really, because there wasn't a huge amount for Middle New Zealand. And I think, again, that's really been the setup for the election coming up.
I was interested to watch David Seymour being interviewed by stuff.co.nz, and he basically said he didn't trust Treasury's figures. I don't know if you saw this conversation because, the government reported, inflation will come down, all these things. And David Seymour basically said, yeah, but Treasury's been wrong the whole time. From an economist point of view, how trustworthy is what Treasury projects?
That's a good one, good question. And the answer is we don't get much right when it comes to forecasting. It doesn't matter whether it's the Treasury or the banks or the Reserve Bank. We have no idea about what's going to happen in the future. The purpose of the forecast in the budget is not to say this is what will happen. It's to say this is a base case scenario. And on the basis of that, given the decisions we make, how will things fall out? So, I mean, it's very easy for David to go and say, oh, I don't trust Treasury. But what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Is he more accurate?
Yeah. It's exactly what I thought, Shamubeel. I'm like, if I'm in government and I have to make decisions, what do I make those decisions based on? Do I make them based on what Treasury says or what David Seymour says? And I'd probably lean towards Treasury, but yeah, it's sort of what I was thinking as well. It's a crazy one. But I guess the opposition has to look for something to poke the bear with, don't they, if they're going to get their headlines as well.
And legitimate criticism as well, because as forecasters, economists are not good. Like with anything, forecasting is incredibly uncertain. And we should never think of the future as some kind of known track, right? We should be thinking about it in terms of scenarios. And, last couple of years have really shown us that, right? With COVID, floods, cyclones, how could you predict any of this stuff?
Yeah. Look, I've got a couple of questions actually based around that, Shamubeel, because it's just like Joe Ordinary, right? The dumb dude at the bottom of the South Island. I hear one political side saying one thing and then the other political side saying the absolute opposite. And I'm trying to figure out who's right or is the truth somewhere in the middle. How would you describe our economy right now? Not projecting, not looking forward, but how are we doing today? And how does that compare to the rest of the world?
Look, there is the aggregates, those numbers that you see talked about on TV or in the newspapers versus what you're feeling in your own family budget or in your own business.
Yeah.
And the reality is right now, people are hurting because your money doesn't go as far. The weekly shop is way more expensive. And for many businesses, they're really struggling because there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think the current situation is people are living with fear. And I think that would be a reasonable description. Are we doing much worse than other parts of the world? No. Everybody's in a similar kind of situation where there is this worry about the cost of living, the increases in interest rates, and the lack of certainty in the future. So we are probably in the same place if you look at the forecast from Treasury, caveating that it's not always accurate.
Yep.
They reckon it's going to be kind of okay, that things are pretty much at stall speed, and hopefully by the end of this year, we'll start to recover. Yep, I think that's probably how it's going to look from the aggregate. For the individuals, I think this year is going to be really tough, especially those people who are still to refinance their mortgages over the coming months.
Looking back to the budget from today, some of the criticisms that have come out from oppositional parties, well, even from within their own parties, because the Greens weren't that happy with a few things. As an economist, what do you look at the budget and do you think, yeah, that's a fair criticism? Anything come to mind?
Look, it's probably for me is the lack of coherence, right? We're going to build more schools, but when are we going to pay our teachers enough so that we have a workforce of teachers that are there to actually use those classrooms and deliver the education that our children want and need? So there is a lack of coherence. So quite often there is this kind of, we do these piecemeal things, all those little band-aids to try and deliver things. And I think that's exactly what's happening with budgets in successive years, in successive different political parties. That would be the big criticism, the lack of coherence and being well knit, because they only like announcing the things that gives them at least, that kind of figurative ribbon cutting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Hey, last question as well. Well, last couple of questions based around the same thing. Because we've got you tonight, I'd like to figure out a bit more about where we're at and what is happening with the economy. I'm obviously, as I said, Joe Idiot. But the way I sometimes have understood the reason that the world is in the position where it is right now with things like inflation is because during COVID, we quote unquote printed money. But the reason we quote unquote printed money was to do things like, make sure our small businesses didn't go bankrupt and enable people to stay home. Is that a fair assertion as to one of the driving factors to where inflation is today? Yes, because governments have spent more, but they had to, because if they didn't, we would have lost half of our small businesses with no support.
Yeah, look, it's been such a bizarre few years, right? In 2020, I'd say a lot of the inflation was because things were just shut. You couldn't move things around, you couldn't make things. So we created this almost this gummed up economy around the world. And then in 2021, 2022, I think we saw this big opening up with all the subsidies and things like that. And they were very different in different parts of the world. In New Zealand, it was largely about saving businesses. In
Yep.
places like the US, they actually sent checks to people to spend. So they're quite different things. So I think I prefer our approach in the sense that we didn't have that mass closure of businesses or unemployment, and that was really positive, right? So when we recovered, we didn't get the same kind of massive spend up and massive kind of increase that we had seen in other places. But what was different about us was we borrowed a shit ton of money to buy houses from each other, and house prices rocketed up. So that's where a lot of New Zealand's inflation was different from other places. So I'd say, it's not one kind of thing that was the same everywhere, but the inflation surge was global, and it has been very high. It's starting to come off. I'm really hopeful, not optimistic, but hopeful that it is going to come off over the next 12 months or so, mainly because interest rates around the world have just increased so much that so many people are going to be in a world of pain.
Second part of that question, if it is as I asked and as you've just said, because of those two things, we as citizens decided to spend too much for the houses over that period, and also the government helping keep small businesses open and also helping people stay home when they had COVID. If those were two of the major factors to driving inflation, what would our economy look like today, do you think, if we had have not done that? Like if we had have followed, like I remember Simon Bridges very early on when he was leader wanting to open up the borders, which wasn't a particularly good result for him. It was probably what led him to the downfall of his leadership. But if we had have taken the opposite approach, which is what we hear many in opposition saying today we now should have done with hindsight, what would we don't need to talk about what the death rate would be, for example, from COVID, but what would just the economy have looked like today, in your opinion, if we hadn't have supported those businesses and, I don't know, we hadn't have had the money to enable people to stay home when they were sick?
Yeah, I'd start by saying that I wouldn't have necessarily done things the way that we did with the benefit of hindsight. But given the situation we were in, which was extraordinarily uncertain, right? And the risks were just extraordinary. We were thinking that we might be facing depression-style economic shock.
Yeah.
That was very frightening. And that was the reason why governments around the world, including ours, just went so hard, not just around the health prescriptions, but also around the economic prescriptions. I think in terms of the efforts to save business failures and keep people home so then we could enforce the public health policy stuff, that was very good. I think the easing up on lending for houses was silly. No house was ever going to die as a result of COVID, right? We
Yeah.
should have made it easier to borrow money for consumers, so consumer loans, because people who are poor could not access money through that COVID period. And we should have made it easier for businesses to borrow money, because those are the kinds of groups of people who would have hurt the most during that period. So I think that was probably the big mistake. And also on the things like wage subsidies, we probably could have made it a bit tighter and slightly less easy to get. But those are quibbles at the margin, rather than saying I would have done things differently. If we hadn't done those things, I think New Zealand would have suffered incredibly. I think we would have had massive amounts of unemployment. I think many of the business people who today are complaining about not wanting to pay more tax, they would have been dead. Those businesses would be dead today. They would not exist.
Yeah.
And that takes a huge toll, right? Starting a business is hard. Running a business is hard. All the learning by doing that you do, those things are very difficult to reclaim by just starting a new business. So I think that we've had a lot of benefits in sustaining an economy relatively undisrupted through that COVID period.
Hey, it's been really good to speak to you today. I've really enjoyed it. I guess one last thing, thinking about moving forward, do you think this government will introduce a wealth tax? That's something that's in the news at the moment in the lead up to the election. Do you think they should introduce a wealth tax?
I think we should absolutely have a wealth tax. Will this government introduce one, or this political party introduce one? I don't think so. I don't think so because our rich are very well organized. I think most New Zealanders have a mistaken belief that in the future they might be rich, and so rich that they don't want to be caught in that wealth
Yeah.
tax net. So, I think we are pretty selfish, and I think we're too selfish to implement the kinds of policies that would actually build our nation going forward. So, we need to have a crisis that's even bigger than we've experienced so far before we're going to tackle those big issues around tax and fairness in our country.
Hey, Shamubeel, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you tonight. I very much appreciate you giving us some time, and I hope we can connect again before the upcoming election. But thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Pat.